a.m. to 9 p.m.
So I'm finding these things, ancient pottery and the like, stone tools, that in many respects were like the materials that we had found on archaeological sites in Oklahoma and other places in the U.S. I then brought those materials to Freetown to show the Peace Corps National Director, ultimately the United States Ambassador. And the ambassador, who was the youngest in the world at that time, he was 33 years old, and he had just finished a PhD at Yale in African Studies. He looked at them and he said, well, nice, but the most important historical site in the country is Bunce Island. And he made an arrangement for me to go there. Of course, it looked very different from the way you saw it. They've now begun these preservation efforts. But one of the things that's so remarkable about Bunce Island, as I said yesterday, I think, or the day before, I'm losing track of time, yesterday, was that it was, when the slave traders walked away, nothing changed, except time went by and the tropical storms came in and the like. So it was an eerie place. And at various times I've called it the Pompeii of the Atlantic slave trade, or a ghost town of the Atlantic slave trade. You could not help but feel what went on there. It was impossible not to feel it. But I started doing a lot of archaeological reconnaissance there, collecting artifacts, looking at the walls, measuring the walls, making a ground plan of the place. And as I said earlier, it was a baffling place to me. I've never seen architecture like that. But when I got back to the United States, I was able to access a lot of information. I should say none of it on Bunce Island, but a lot of it on the other major slave castles in West Africa. And one of the things I began to realize was that unlike most of these slave trading bases, and you all know, of course, Gorée in Senegal, Cape Coast, and Elmina in Ghana, there are about 42 big ones. This one was different in a lot of respects. Only about 3% or 4% of the Africans taken across the Atlantic during the Atlantic slave trade wound up in what is now the United States. So they went to the Caribbean, to Brazil, to places where sugar was grown. Sugar was a big money maker. And so to have only 4% of the Africans taken over, winding up in the United States, what became the United States, I felt from the start that the chances of Bunce Island having any significant link to the United States, the chances were very small. But it turned out that it was a very special place for Americans, in that it shipped a great many enslaved people to Charleston, South Carolina, and later to Georgia. The reason being that when I got back to the United States, that is what I researched. And I found that the year I joined Peace Corps, 74, was the year that a very important academic book was published, Black Majority, by Peter Wood, and historian, I think, for many years at I think it was University of North Carolina, or Duke, one or the other. But he's the one who first made this connection. And I read his work, and also other scholars were then coming into the field of looking at this connection. It fascinated scholars, it fascinated teachers, because here was an example of where Africans were brought over to a couple of colonies, not just for their physical labor, but for their know-how. And it became very clear that rice is such a sophisticated form of agriculture that the American planters from a cold place in Europe had no idea how to grow it, how to process it. So it meant that the knowledge that the Africans brought was fundamental to this industry. But then when you look a little bit deeper, one of the things you discover is that rice was actually the biggest moneymaker in the North American colonies for a long time. I found a debate that had to do with adopting our Constitution, in which one of the delegates stood up and said, hit the table, and he said, I would not have this in our Constitution for all the rice in Carolina. So rice was proverbial as something that you could get rich off of. Now, if you compare it to the Caribbean or Brazil, sugar, no. It wasn't that big a money earner. But for the North American colonies, it was actually a big deal. So I had been asked by so many people, including local villagers on the nearby islands, where did our people go? And I had no idea before I left. I had no idea. I thought Jamaica was probably the best answer. It's still not a bad answer, but because they weren't all taken, needless to say, from Bunce Island to South Carolina and Georgia. But the numbers are really important. My best guess at this point is that 25 to 30% of the enslaved people who were taken out of Bunce Island wound up in the Low Country. That's phenomenal. I mean, if you look at any of these other slave castles, including the ones people go to all the time, it's close to zero. Because they're going to the West Indies where the real money was made. So all of this caused me to go deeper and deeper into the subject. One of the things I found out is that the scholars who had been looking at the figures, especially for Charleston, as to where Africans were coming from, they weren't familiar enough with 18th century British terminology for Africa to understand what they were seeing. They were seeing Sierra Leone as a little tiny number, and then there were some other tiny things, like Windward Coast, and Rice Coast, of course. And what they were not doing was adding all those up because they're the same thing. And then it starts to be, for South Carolina, it starts to be about together. That's surprising. One of the things, too, that came out of that period was the extraordinary input, Bunce Island, I should say, effect that Bunce Island had on early American history. I know Amadou must have mentioned this by now, but it turned out when it came time for the Americans and the Brits to negotiate their peace at the end of the Revolutionary War, the negotiations were conducted in part between the British owner of Bunce Island and his longtime agent in Charleston for selling Africans off of these ships that came directly from Bunce Island. That was Henry Lawrence and Richard Oswald. So these things were all very important. And when I first brought these things to the attention here of the government, the United States Embassy, and just a lot of people, because I was constantly giving, when I saw how affected people were by this, people over here wanted to know where their people went with the same kind of passion that African Americans want to know where their people came from. And I had not expected that. And so I was constantly being asked to go to a school or some other educational institution and give a talk on this, and people couldn't get enough of it. Now I mentioned how all of this led, people are still bringing in, including me, new information. So these two, Liberia, these places were.
And the person who should touch base with is John Kizzle. And so that started. The interesting thing about Kizzle is that spent 7 years, but longer than that, about 10 years in Charleston. And Julie, which is attorney. But Kizzle, we don't know much. This has been seconded by others, is that he was learning the Bible. And the Bible was his textbook for him to do so. Now, it was not against the law at that time in South Carolina to do that. We know that Kizzle had a very strong belief that all black people in America should go back to Africa if they had the opportunity. He said Africa is the land of black people, and that's where they should go. And he was convinced that if given the opportunity through colonization movement, that they would go back. And he was that did not happen. But he was the point person for the first group of African American settlers